Every evening, as the city lights flickered on and people rushed past with coffee cups and briefcases, James stood on the corner of Fifth and Main, cradling a worn-out guitar and singing to anyone who would listen. His voice, soulful, raw, filled with something that can't be taught, often got lost in the noise. Some people spared $1. Most didn't even glance his way. But one night, everything changed. A black car stopped at the curb. The window rolled down, and inside sat a woman who could have been from another world, wealthy, powerful, untouchable. She listened, and then she stepped out. What she offered James wasn't just money. It was a chance at something he hadn't dared to dream of in years, a life he thought he had already lost. This is the story of a father, a street corner, a song, and the woman who believed in him when no one else would. Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? The wind cut through his jacket like it wasn't even there. Layers meant nothing when the city decided to remind you just how forgotten you were. James adjusted the guitar strap on his shoulder and shifted his weight from one foot to the other, trying to coax feeling back into his toes. He hadn't felt warm in weeks. Not really. He cleared his throat, coughed once, and began to strum. The chords came slow at first, fingers stiff from the cold, but muscle memory kicked in like it always did. His voice followed, raspy, worn, but deep with something that made even the drunk guys stumbling out of the bar 2 blocks away pause for a moment. He didn't sing like someone trying to impress. He sang like someone who needed it more than air. Most people passed him by without so much as a glance. The occasional clink of a coin in the cracked guitar case was the only sign anyone even noticed. A toddler tugged on his mother's sleeve and pointed at him with wide eyes. The mother pulled her child away like James was contagious. He kept singing. At the edge of the sidewalk, bundled in a coat 2 sizes too big, sat Lily, 7 years old and already too used to hunger. Her chin rested on her knees, arms wrapped tight around herself. He watched her out of the corner of his eye. She was trying to smile. She always did that, tried to make it easier on him, tried to be brave. James turned back to the street and poured everything he had into the last chorus. His voice cracked halfway through, but he didn't care. It was real, raw. And maybe that's what hurt the most. Because once, a long time ago, this voice had sold out shows. Once, there'd been a record label and a manager and a tour lined up across the country. Once, he was going to be someone. Now he was a ghost with a guitar, playing for change on a frozen street corner while his daughter waited for the song to end so they could split a cup of soup and try to find space on the shelter floor. But even ghosts have stories, and someone somewhere was about to hear his. It started like any other night. James stood beneath the flickering street lamp on Fifth and Main, back against the icy brick wall, guitar in his hands like a lifeline he couldn't let go of. The city moved around him, noisy, indifferent, brutal. The hum of engines, the distant sirens, the low chatter of people trying to get somewhere fast and forget whatever was behind them. He tuned the strings by ear, ignoring the sting of cold on his fingertips. One deep breath. Then he began to play. The melody drifted into the night, a soft, aching thing that seemed too fragile for the street it lived on. People slowed, some glanced, a few even stopped. A small crowd gathered, college kids sipping overpriced coffee, a couple of tourists fumbling for their phones, a man in a rumpled coat who stood swaying gently with his eyes closed. And then she appeared. She didn't fit the scene. That was the first thing James noticed. She stepped out of the back seat of a sleek black car that idled at the curb, the kind of vehicle that didn't belong in this part of town unless it was lost or slumming for character. Her heels clicked against the sidewalk like a metronome, sharp and deliberate. Her coat was long, expensive, cinched at the waist. Her dark hair fell in soft waves around her shoulders, untouched by the wind, like it somehow knew not to mess with her. She stopped just outside the small arc of people who had gathered, and unlike everyone else, She didn't reach for her phone. She didn't talk. She just watched. James felt her gaze before he saw her. Something about it made him stumble over a cord just slightly. His heart knocked against his ribs. He didn't know why. He didn't sing for tips that night. Not really. He sang for her. The song shifted, an old one he used to play before everything fell apart. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't even upbeat. But it was honest. His voice rose and cracked and recovered, and somewhere in the middle of the second verse, the woman's eyes softened. Just a flicker, but he caught it. She stayed through the entire song. And when it ended, when the last note faded and the other listeners began to drift away, she didn't move. She stood there, like she had heard something no one else did. Then, without a word, she turned and stepped back into her car. It drove off into the night, leaving James staring at the spot where she had stood, his breath fogging in the cold. He didn't know who she was, but he knew, he felt it in his bones, that wasn't the last time he'd see her. James had seen all kinds of faces pass him by, some blank, some pitying, some disgusted. A few looked like they wanted to help but couldn't figure out how, and most just looked straight through him like he didn't exist at all. That was part of the job, if you could call it that. You learned not to take it personally. You learned to sing for the ones who didn't look away. But her, she was different. She hadn't moved once during the song, not a step forward, not a glance down at the guitar case like most people did when they were deciding whether or not to part with $1. She hadn't even blinked when a group of loud teenagers brushed past her on the sidewalk, laughing like the city was theirs, and nobody else mattered. She stood like the noise didn't touch her, like the cold didn't reach her, unbothered, unmovable. And when the last note dissolved into the air, when the others started clapping half-heartedly or turning back to their phones, she still didn't move. Her hands stayed at her sides, one gloved, one bare, a phone clenched loosely in her palm like she'd forgotten it was there. Her eyes, sharp, intelligent, impossible to ignore, were fixed on James like she was trying to read something on his face he didn't even know was there. James gave her a small nod, the kind he usually gave to anyone who lingered. She didn't return it. She didn't smile. Her mouth was set in a line, not unfriendly, but not warm either. She looked like someone weighing a decision, and then she turned. No tip, no compliment, no words at all. She climbed into the back seat of that polished car like she belonged to a different world, and maybe she did. The door shut with a quiet click. The engine hummed. The car disappeared down the block like it had never been there in the first place. James stood there, his fingers still curled around the neck of his guitar, the city rushing on around him. There was something in her eyes he couldn't shake, not judgment, not pity, something else, something harder to name. It wasn't the look of someone who passed by and forgot. It was the look of someone who saw something they weren't ready for and couldn't unsee. The shelter always smelled like old socks, boiled beans, and something sour they could never quite scrub out of the linoleum. The overhead lights buzzed with a dull electric whine that matched the headache pulsing behind James's eyes. He pushed the door open with his shoulder, his guitar case bumping against the frame as he guided Lily inside. She was half asleep on her feet, her hand in his, her small backpack sliding off one shoulder. He gently adjusted it for her, even though she was too tired to notice. In his other hand, he clutched the meager earnings from the night, 4 crumpled $1 bills, some loose change, and a granola bar someone had tossed into the case with a nod and a guilty smile. The kind of person who couldn't meet your eyes, but still wanted to feel like they'd done something good. He handed the granola bar to Lily. She took it without a word, sat down on the bench just inside the door, and began to nibble on the corner, like it was a feast. James swallowed hard, the knot in his throat tightening. The man at the intake desk glanced up, recognized them, and gave a quick nod. Room 12's still open, but you'll need to be out by 7. Yeah, James said, I know. Room 12 wasn't a room. It was a cot behind a thin curtain, in a shared space with 5 other families. You learned to sleep through coughs, nightmares, and the soft sounds of quiet crying. James had learned to curl his arm around Lily in just the right way that her head would rest on his shoulder, and not the cold vinyl of the cot. She always said she liked it better than a real bed. He knew she was lying, but she lied for him the way he lied for her. After brushing her teeth in the cracked sink down the hall, Lily crawled onto the cot without protest. James followed, pulling their donated blanket over both of them. She curled into his chest, still chewing the last of the granola bar. "Did you sing the butterfly song tonight?" she asked, her voice small. "Yeah," James murmured. "And guess what? Someone actually stopped to listen." "Did they clap?" He hesitated. "Not really." She yawned. Maybe next time, maybe, he thought, maybe next time. The cot creaked under James's weight as he leaned over to tuck the blanket tighter around Lily's small frame. She was already half asleep, lashes fluttering against her cheeks, clutching the edge of her worn stuffed bunny, the one thing she'd managed to keep after everything fell apart. Its ears were frayed, one eye missing, but it had survived, like her, like him. Outside the flimsy curtain that separated them from the rest of the shelter, voices murmured, some low and tired, others raised in quiet frustration. A child somewhere cried out in their sleep. An argument simmered near the showers, something about a missing backpack. Again, James tried to block it out. He sat beside her, pulled the guitar onto his lap, and let his fingers find the old chords, the ones she liked, the ones he used to play in her nursery back when the apartment had a door that locked, a kitchen with groceries, a fridge with magnets she used to rearrange into nonsense words back when her mom was still alive. He hummed first, then let the melody stretch into the quiet like he was coaxing something fragile into the open. Lily stirred slightly, letting out a breath, but didn't open her eyes. That was how he knew she felt safe enough to sleep. The lullaby was simple, 4 chords. A handful of words he'd written himself, years ago, about butterflies and summer skies and dreams that never ended. It was the first song he'd ever written that wasn't for a stage. It was just for her. His voice cracked midway through. He covered it with a whisper, his throat thick. He hadn't cried in front of her since the night they lost the apartment. He wouldn't start now. When the song ended, Lily's breathing hurried, deepened. James leaned down and kissed her forehead, careful not to wake her. She shifted, murmured something unintelligible, then went still again. He set the guitar down softly, then lay beside her, staring up at the ceiling with its water-stained tiles and flickering fluorescent light. He kept hearing the song in his head, the melody looping like a promise he was desperate to keep. Tomorrow, he told himself. Tomorrow he'd sing again. And maybe, just maybe, that woman in the car would come back. The downtown skyline gleamed like a crown in the morning sun, sharp angles and glass towers reflecting a world far removed from street corners and shelter cots. On the top floor of one of those towers, behind frosted glass and polished steel, Elena Dawson sat in silence, the morning headlines untouched on her tablet, and a half-finished espresso cooling on her desk. She had listened to the clip 5 times already. Her assistant had sent it to her late the night before, after some intern flagged it. From a local busker's YouTube channel. The quality was rough, just a shaky phone recording with wind distortion and passing car noise, but the voice cut through all of that. It was weathered and broken in places, but not from lack of control, from pain, from life. It held the kind of emotion no studio session could fake, the kind that haunted people long after the song ended. Elena sat back, her fingers steepled beneath her chin. "Find out who he is," she had said, as soon as the recording ended, and now she had the answer in a folder on her desk. James Monroe, 38. Former indie folk artist, had one breakout single almost a decade ago before fading into obscurity. No official releases after 2016, no known current address, no agent, no manager. Last known residence was foreclosed 3 years ago. A handwritten note in the corner. frequently seen performing at 5th and Main evenings. There was a photo, too, not a recent one. Younger, cleaner, smiling with a baby in his arms. The baby was Lily. The woman beside him, her name was Julia Monroe, deceased. Car accident. Elena didn't need to read the rest. She remembered the name. She closed the folder and looked out at the city sprawling below. This wasn't just about a voice. She'd seen something in his eyes that night, something raw and untamed, something that made her feel for the first time in a long time like she wasn't listening to another manufactured talent begging for a brand deal. This was a man who had bled for his music. Elena Dawson wasn't easily moved. But last night, on a cold street corner in a forgotten part of town, something had shifted. She wasn't sure what it meant yet, but she knew one thing for certain. She was going back. The wind wasn't as cruel that night, but James still felt it in his bones. He always did. Cold had a way of settling into places that had already been hollowed out by grief. Still, he sat up like he always did, guitar case open, strings tuned as best as he could manage, with fingers that didn't bend like they used to. Lily sat on her usual spot, an old milk crate covered in a folded hoodie, coloring with a dull crayon in a notebook she found in the shelter's donation bin. Her cheeks were flushed from the chill, but she didn't complain. She never did. James started to play, easing into a slow, finger-picked tune. A love song, though he didn't really believe in those anymore. The kind of song that sounded like the space between two people who used to know each other well. The melody drifted into the street, soft and aching, and once again, the world barely noticed. But then the car pulled up, same black luxury sedan, same quiet stop at the curb. He recognized it immediately, even before the door opened, and she stepped out. Her coat tonight was a deep burgundy, the kind of color that made people turn and stare. Her heels clicked again, but this time she walked closer, closer than before, close enough to catch the tail end of the verse, close enough to really see him, his patched jeans, his worn boots, the lines around his eyes that hadn't been there 10 years ago. He kept playing, but something in him tightened. This wasn't the kind of woman who showed up twice. When the song ended, she didn't clap, she didn't smile. She pulled a $20 bill from her coat pocket and placed it gently in the guitar case. Then she looked up at him. "What's your name?" she asked. James stared at her for a second, unsure if she was serious. Most people didn't care. He cleared his throat. "James," he said. "James Monroe." A pause. Something flickered behind her eyes. "Thank you, James," she said softly. Then she turned and walked away. Not back to the car this time, but down the sidewalk, vanishing into the crowd like she belonged there. James stood still, the $20 bill fluttering slightly in the wind. He didn't know what just happened, but it didn't feel like an accident. James didn't expect to see her again the next night. But there she was, same coat, different heels, and that same unreadable look in her eyes. She stood across from him as he finished a cover of an old Springsteen song, her hands tucked neatly into her pockets, her chin tilted slightly, studying him like a puzzle she hadn't quite figured out yet. He nodded at her when the last note faded, more out of habit than anything else. She didn't tip this time, didn't move, just kept watching. It was starting to get under his skin. "Back again?" he asked, slinging the guitar strap over his shoulder, trying to keep his tone neutral. "I wanted to hear you sing," she said, matter of fact, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. James snorted under his breath. "Plenty of people with guitars in this city. Most of them aren't freezing on street corners. But they don't sound like you," she said. There was something in the way she said it, quiet, pointed. Not flattery, not pity, observation. He turned to adjust Lily's hoodie, buying time. She was curled up beside him, her head resting on her knees, dozing with the gentle ease only children and the completely exhausted could manage. The woman stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Where'd you learn to sing like that?" James didn't answer right away. His fingers flexed, the cold biting into his knuckles. He hated this part, the way people looked at him when they realized he used to be something. The shift in their tone, their posture, the 100 questions that came after. "Nowhere," he said finally, eyes locked on a crack in the sidewalk. "Just picked it up." "You don't pick up that kind of voice," she replied. "You lived it." He looked at her then, really looked. Her gaze didn't waver. She wasn't trying to flatter him, she wasn't playing some angle, but that only made it worse. "I used to sing for people who clapped at the end," James said, shrugging. "Now I sing for people who keep walking." He turned away before she could respond, crouched down to gather his things, his guitar case still mostly empty. She didn't say another word, but she didn't leave either. There was a time when James didn't play on street corners. There was a time when his name was printed on posters and whispered in backstage circles as the next big thing. Back then, he played under lights that actually worked, in clubs that smelled like sweat and spilled beer instead of urine and old dreams. The crowds were small but growing. His songs were raw, honest, the kind of lyrics people quoted in captions and scrawled into journals like they were their own. He had a record deal on the table, a manager who believed in him, and a woman who sat in the front row every night, mouthing every word like it was sacred. Julia. She had a laugh that made people turn their heads, a presence that grounded him when the chaos of half-packed bars and late-night rehearsals started to spin. She was the first person who ever told him his voice sounded like a bruise healing. She was also the one who convinced him to record Hollow Season, the song that caught fire online and turned everything from a pipe dream into a career. And then just like that, it was gone. One icy morning, a car coming back from a grocery run, a drunk driver who never hit the brakes. James got the call in the middle of a studio session. He still remembered the engineer's voice when he asked if everything was okay. It wasn't. It never would be. Julia died before the ambulance even got there. Lily was in the back seat, 3 years old, somehow untouched, except for a tiny scar near her eyebrow and a silence that lasted weeks. James stopped singing after that. He walked away from the contract, the stage, the fans who begged for one more song. Nothing made sense without her. The music felt like a lie, a performance he couldn't stomach anymore. He sold the equipment, let the lease on their apartment lapse, took whatever savings they had left, and tried to keep Lily warm, fed, and unaware of how quickly their world was caving in. The gigs stopped. The calls stopped. And eventually, so did the hope. Now he sang again, not for fame, not for applause. He sang because it was the only way he knew how to stay alive. By the end of the week, James could feel her presence before he saw her. It was like the air shifted, went still, quieter somehow, even though the city never stopped humming. Sirens still wailed in the distance, tires still hissed over wet pavement. The occasional drunk still stumbled past with a slurred insult or a song request he never planned to pay for. But when she showed up, everything else seemed to recede. Elena didn't speak, not after that first real exchange. She didn't ask more questions. She didn't press. She just stood there, a few feet from the curb, gloved hands folded in front of her, eyes fixed on him like he was the only thing worth watching in a world full of noise. It unnerved him. People didn't linger unless they wanted something, a song, a story, a piece of you they could wear like a souvenir. But she never asked for anything. She just came, night after night, like clockwork, and listened. At first he thought she was studying him. Maybe she worked for some new agency he hadn't heard of, some fancy brand looking for a charity case to sponsor. Or maybe she just liked sad stories and broken things. There were people like that. People who collected tragedy the way others collected art. But then, one night after a particularly rough set, his voice hoarse, fingers numb and barely keeping hold of the chords, he looked up and found her watching with something different in her eyes. It wasn't curiosity, it wasn't pity, it was grief. Just for a second, a flicker like a shadow passing behind a curtain. And then it was gone. She left after that song, like always. No words, no tips. Just a nod so small it could have been imagined. James sat down beside Lily, who had curled up against the base of the building with a scarf wrapped up to her nose, and rubbed his hands together to chase the feeling back into them. "She's not like the others," Lily mumbled, half asleep. James looked at the empty sidewalk where the woman had stood and swallowed hard. No, she wasn't. The night was colder than usual, the kind of cold that settles into your chest and makes breathing feel like swallowing broken glass. James had been playing for nearly 2 hours, but the crowd had thinned early. Most people weren't in the mood to stop for music when the wind cut through their coats like knives. His fingers were raw, the string stinging more than singing, but he kept playing anyway. He had to. Lily huddled beside him, tucked inside 2 sweaters and a jacket that still didn't fit quite right. Her mittens were damp from the slush on the ground. She didn't complain. She never did. But James could see her teeth chattering, see the way her little fingers curled into themselves like they were trying to disappear. That's when the scent hit him. Coffee. Real coffee. Not the burnt kind from the shelter's vending machine, but the rich, roasted kind that cost more than he made in a night. He looked up. Elena stood a few feet away, her heels making no sound on the concrete. In one hand, a paper cup with steam rising through the frigid air. In the other, a smaller cup, hot chocolate, judging by the whipped cream melting at the rim. She held them out, wordless. James stared at her. His pride flared, hot and immediate, like it always did when someone tried to hand him something he hadn't asked for. He almost shook his head, almost stood up, and told her he didn't take handouts. But then, Lily coughed, a small, dry sound, and her hands, tiny, trembling, tightened around the ends of her scarf. He looked back at Elena. Her expression didn't change. She wasn't smiling, wasn't begging him to say thank you. She was just offering. No strings, no judgment. He stood slowly, his knees aching from the concrete, and took the cups from her hands. "Thank you," he muttered, barely more than a breath, and she nodded. "It's nothing." But it wasn't nothing, not to him. He handed the smaller cup to Lily, who lit up instantly, wrapping her mittened hands around it like it was treasure. Elena lingered a moment longer, then asked quietly, "Why here? Why the street?" James didn't look at her when he answered, "Because no one can take this from me." The sky was bruised with cloud cover when Elena showed up again, coat flaring slightly in the wind, a purpose in her stride that wasn't there before. James was midway through an old folk song, one of the few that still came easy, when she stepped into the circle of light from the street lamp. She didn't interrupt. She waited, arms crossed, eyes fixed on him, like she had made a decision and wasn't about to second-guess it. When he finished, the last note trailing off into the thin winter air, she spoke. "I want to make you an offer," she said. James raised an eyebrow, more from exhaustion than curiosity. Offers didn't come from women in $1,000 coats to men playing on sidewalks. "I don't do birthdays," he said dryly. Elena didn't smile. "I want you to record, in a real studio, one of mine." James blinked, unsure he heard her right. She stepped closer, lowering her voice so Lily wouldn't hear, though the girl was already half asleep with her head on her knees. "I run a music production company. I have space, equipment, people who would kill to sound like you. I'm not offering charity. I'm offering you a shot." It landed like a slap. Not because it was cruel, because it was absurd, because for a split second something deep inside him stirred. That dangerous thing, hope. James stood slowly, brushing snow from his coat. "Why?" he asked. "Why me?" "Because you have something they don't," she said. "Realness, pain, heart. You sing like you're bleeding." He looked away, jaw tightening. That wasn't a compliment. That was exposure. "I'm not interested," he said flatly. "You haven't even heard the details." "I don't need to." Elena stepped back, the wind tugging at her hair. "You're afraid." James met her gaze. "You're damn right I am. I've seen what the industry does to people like me. I lived it." Elena hesitated, something flickering behind her composed exterior. "I'm not asking for your soul," she said quietly. "Just a song." James bent down and picked up his guitar case, the weight familiar in his hand. "I've already given enough," he said. Then he turned, scooped Lily into his arms, and walked into the dark. The studio had smelled like lavender-scented air freshener and old coffee. Polished floors, glass walls, chrome accents, like stepping into a world too clean for someone like James. He remembered that place vividly, the first label he'd signed with, tucked into a quiet block in Nashville. It was everything he thought he wanted, a dream wrapped in recording booths and deadlines, compliments that felt like contracts, and praise that came with a hook buried just beneath the sugar. At first, it was electric. They loved his voice, called it authentic, marketable, aching with edge. They talked about branding, target audiences, album aesthetics. They changed his name, said James Monroe was too plain, and handed him clothes he would never wear off stage. They edited his lyrics, reshaped his songs, took the ones written for Julia and smoothed the corners until they didn't sound like heartbreak anymore, just noise dressed as sorrow. The worst part was how fast he let them, because they promised him a future, a better life for Julia, a safe one for Lily. And for a while he believed them. He played showcases, filmed interviews, smiled through exhaustion. He sang songs he no longer recognized under lights that made everything look golden, except him. Then came the collapse. The night he told them he wanted to write his own material again, that he didn't want a second album built around someone else's pain. They said no, said he wasn't a songwriter anymore. He was a product. That word stuck in his throat like a nail. So he walked, told the manager to shred the contract, left the studio with nothing but his guitar and a voicemail from his agent asking if he'd lost his mind. He had. Or maybe he finally found it. The gigs dried up overnight. Without the label's push, he was just another man with a guitar in a city full of voices. When Julia died 6 months later, the silence that followed wasn't just grief. It was everything. The career, the hope, the music, it all vanished into that hospital room with her. James hadn't sung into a microphone since, and he wasn't about to start now, not for anyone, especially not for someone who thought she saw potential. The shelter's fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting everything in that pale, institutional glow that made warmth feel like a memory. James sat on the edge of the cot, elbows on his knees, trying to work the stiffness out of his back. Another long night on concrete, another morning of wondering if he'd made the right choices, walking away from the studio, from the offer, from whatever Elena Dawson thought she saw in him. Lily was curled up on the floor with a stubby crayon clutched in one hand and her tongue poking out in concentration. She'd found the crayons in a donation bin the day before, along with a half-used spiral notebook missing its cover. She guarded both like treasure. James had learned not to ask what she was drawing. It gave her something that felt normal, even if nothing else in their lives did. "You want to see?" she asked suddenly. He turned. She held the paper up proudly, her smile stretching wider than it had in days. The drawing was messy, lines crooked, proportions off, but the intent was clear. There was a big stage lit up with bright yellow stars. A crowd of tiny, smiling stick figures stood below it, arms raised like they were cheering. On the stage stood a tall man with a guitar, his smile drawn in purple. Beside him, in the front row, was a smaller figure with pigtails and a big heart on her shirt. "That's me," Lily said, pointing to herself. "And that's you." Singing. James blinked, throat tightening. She looked up at him, eyes wide and hopeful. "You should do it, Daddy." He didn't answer. "Miss Elena could help," she added, matter of fact, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. James looked down at the drawing again, trying to ignore the ache in his chest. "Where'd you even get that idea?" he asked gently. "You said she had a music place," Lily said, "and she likes your songs. She listens." He swallowed hard, unable to meet her eyes. "It's not that simple, kiddo." "It could be," she whispered, setting the picture on his lap. "If you let it." James stared at the crayon version of himself on that stage, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't look so lost. The phone felt heavier than it should have, like it knew what it represented. James sat outside the shelter on the cracked concrete steps, the morning sun doing its best to pretend it was warm, though the chill still lingered in his bones. His guitar rested beside him, silent for once. Lily was inside, showing off her crayon drawing to one of the volunteers, her laughter echoing faintly through the metal door behind him. He stared at the business card in his hand. White, sleek, minimal. Just a name, Elena Dawson, and a direct number printed in crisp black font. No slogan, no frills, just a line straight into whatever world she came from. James had held on to it longer than he meant to, thought about throwing it away more times than he could count. But then Lily started talking about stages again, about microphones and spotlights and how Miss Elena believes in you. And something inside him shifted, not for him. He was done chasing dreams that chewed people up. But Lily still believed they were real. He took a breath and dialed. Each ring felt like a question. Each second dragged. And then her voice, calm, measured, unmistakable. "This is Elena." James hesitated. His tongue felt thick. "It's James," he said finally. "James Monroe." There was a pause, just long enough to make him wonder if she'd forgotten. "I was hoping you'd call," she said. He rubbed a hand over his face, not sure how to start. "I'm not promising anything," he muttered. "But if that studio offer's still open, it is." Another pause, a longer one. "I'm not doing this to get back into anything," he added quickly. "This isn't about some comeback. This is for her, for Lily. She thinks I still have something to give." Elena's voice softened just slightly. "Maybe she's right." James closed his eyes and leaned back against the cold brick wall, the weight of the decision still pressing on his chest. "I'll come by tomorrow," he said. "I'll be ready," she replied. He hung up without another word. And for the first time in months, maybe years, the silence didn't feel like failure. It felt like the start of something. The moment James stepped through the studio doors, he wanted to turn around and walk right back out. The space was nothing like the makeshift setups he used to record in a decade ago. No scratchy foam taped to apartment walls or thrift store microphones duct taped to stands. This place was polished and precise. The air smelled like wood polish and warm circuitry. Everything gleamed. It didn't feel like music lived here. It felt like expectation did. Lily clung to his hand, her eyes wide, spinning slowly as she took it all in. Elena was already there, waiting near the front desk, dressed in black and effortlessly composed, like she hadn't just opened the doors to a world James had sworn never to touch again. "You made it," she said. James gave a stiff nod, not trusting himself to speak. His throat was already dry. He hated how fast this place could shrink him. Elena led them through a glass hallway and into a live room with wood-paneled walls and a piano so grand it looked like it belonged in a concert hall. The booth sat behind a soundproof window, lit from within, glowing like an interrogation room. "This is Paul," she said, gesturing toward the man already behind the mixing console, mid-50s, tired eyes, no fake smile. James appreciated that. Paul gave him a once-over, then a nod. "Mic's hot when you're ready." James set his guitar down like it might bite him. Every instinct told him to walk. But then Lily tugged at his sleeve. "Sing the Butterfly Song," she whispered, like it was a secret. He took a shaky breath and stepped up to the mic. The headphones settled over his ears with a snap, and suddenly the world narrowed. Just him, the guitar, and the blinking red light on the glass that meant someone was listening. He glanced toward the booth. Elena stood with her arms crossed, expression unreadable. Watching, not judging, waiting. He strummed a single chord, then another. And finally, when he felt the tremor in his voice stabilize just enough, he sang. The first note came out too soft, The second cracked slightly, but by the third something opened inside him. And Elena, behind the glass, didn't move, didn't speak, but her eyes never left him. The first verse barely made it out. James sat on the stool in the middle of the booth, guitar in hand, the studio lights overhead too bright, too clinical. The room was silent except for the gentle hiss of the headphone feedback and the occasional faint crackle from the mixing board. He could see Paul's shape behind the glass, adjusting levels, nodding to himself. Elena stood to the side, arms crossed, her expression still unreadable, but her focus was razor-sharp. He strummed the opening chord again, slower this time, let it ring out like he used to in the small clubs, back when every note carried weight and nothing about music felt like pressure. Then he opened his mouth to sing, and the words stuck. They were right there, on the tip of his tongue, in the tightness of his chest. But when he tried to force them into sound, all that came out was air. His throat closed around the melody like it was trying to protect him from himself. He cleared his throat. Tried again. This time a note came out, flat, off-key. His voice cracked halfway through the line and vanished. Paul's voice came through the headset. Take your time. James nodded, eyes shut tight, gripping the neck of his guitar like it was the only thing tethering him to the floor, but it was no use, because all he could see was Julia. He was back in the passenger seat of that godforsaken car, staring at her hands on the wheel, that same lullaby humming from the radio. Lily in the back seat, half asleep, the red light ahead, the flash of headlights in the rearview mirror, the sound of metal and screaming and silence. James's chest tightened. His fingers slipped off the fretboard. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, trying to breathe through it, but it was like drowning in a room full of air. He pulled off the headphones and set the guitar down with shaking hands. From behind the glass he could see Elena step forward, her face no longer unreadable. But James didn't wait. He pushed the studio door open and walked out into the hallway, where the silence wasn't filled with ghosts. James leaned against the cold hallway wall, eyes closed, trying to will the past out of his lungs. The panic had receded, but not by much. His fingers still trembled. His heart thudded in his chest like it was trying to claw its way out. The studio door behind him clicked softly, and he didn't need to open his eyes to know it was her. He heard the sound of her heels slow, then stop a few feet away. Silence stretched between them like a wire, thin and taut. "I didn't expect it to hit like that," he muttered, voice hoarse. "Guess I should have." She didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice was quiet, not fragile, but careful, like someone opening a box that had been locked for years. "My brother played the guitar," she said. "Nothing polished, just soul. He had that thing some people are born with. That rawness. You've got it, too." James turned his head slightly, studying her from the corner of his eye. She wasn't looking at him. Her arms were crossed, but not defensive, more like she was holding something inside. "He wrote songs like they were letters no one was meant to read," she went on. "He played in subway stations, street corners, tiny bars with broken mics and $2 cover charges. Said he didn't care about fame, said it would ruin him." James didn't speak. He didn't have to. She let out a slow breath. "I tried to help, got him meetings, introduced him to producers. He didn't show up to half of them, said they didn't understand him." James knew that story too well. "He overdosed 3 years ago," she said, her voice steady but quiet. "Right before a showcase I begged him to do. I found him in his apartment, guitar still in his lap." James closed his eyes again. "I see him in you," she whispered. "Not the broken part, the real part, the part that made people stop and listen even when they didn't want to." He opened his mouth, then closed it again. Elena turned to go, but before she did, she said one more thing, soft but certain. "You walked out of that room today, but you're not done. You just hit the part that hurts. That's where the music lives." The room was quiet when James walked back in. No one said anything. Paul didn't glance up from the soundboard, didn't reach for a new file. He just nodded once, subtle, like he knew better than to make a moment out of it. Elena stood in the corner, hands tucked into her coat pockets, watching him with a calm kind of stillness. She didn't smile, didn't speak. She just let him walk back in on his own terms. James sat down slowly, guitar back in his lap. The chair creaked under his weight. His fingers hovered over the strings for a long time before they moved. He adjusted the mic, reached for the headphones, took a breath. This time, when the red light blinked on, he didn't flinch. He didn't think about the labels, or the critics, or the missed chances and the haunted spaces where music used to live before it became something he was afraid of. He thought about Lily, the way she looked up at him when he sang that lullaby in the shelter, the way she'd drawn him on that crayon stage, surrounded by people who weren't there to take but to listen, the way she'd said, with that small, steady voice, "Maybe Miss Elena can help." He thought about her laughter, her warmth, her belief in him when he couldn't find any left for himself. And then he played, the same song as before. But this time it was different. Not cleaner, not perfect, but true. His voice trembled on the high notes, broke slightly on the bridge, but it never stopped. It filled the booth with something real, something unpolished and honest, like a handwritten letter smudged with fingerprints and rain. In the control room, Paul leaned forward, listening harder. Elena didn't move. The final chord rang out and faded slowly, hanging in the stillness like a held breath. James sat there for a long moment, eyes closed, guitar still in his hands. And for the first time in years, he didn't feel empty after the last note. He felt alive. It was late, long past midnight, when Elena sat alone in her office, the city skyline spread out beyond the wall of glass behind her. The studio session had ended hours ago. James had taken Lily home, or back to the shelter more likely, with a quiet nod, and a barely there thank you. He hadn't said much. He didn't need to. His voice had already spoken everything he couldn't. The file sat open on her laptop, one take, one song, untouched. She hadn't added reverb, hadn't edited the mix. She didn't want to. There was something in the rawness that made her hesitate every time she hovered over the playback button. It wasn't just a song. It was someone bleeding into a microphone and not asking for permission. Elena clicked play again. The ache in James's voice was undeniable, the kind of sound you don't train for. You earn it through loss. It was the kind of voice you remembered even if you didn't know the name, especially if you didn't. She sat back in her chair, arms crossed, the screen glowing cold light across her face. She opened a blank YouTube channel. No branding, no name, just a single word for the title, Shelter. She didn't list his name, no hashtags, no tags. She uploaded it quietly, almost reverently, just the recording and a black screen. The next morning it had 4,000 views. By noon, 70,000. By nightfall the numbers kept climbing, like they had grown teeth. Comments flooded in, raw, immediate, stunned. Who is this? I don't know why I'm crying. This isn't just a voice, it's a story. This man has lived through something. I feel it. Music bloggers picked it up first, then influencers, then someone in a well-known indie band tweeted the link with just 2 words. This wrecked me. By the next day, people were begging to know who the man behind the voice was. But Elena said nothing. She let the mystery speak for itself, because she knew it wasn't time for the world to meet James Monroe. Not yet. He needed to be ready to choose that moment himself. But the world was already listening. It started with whispers. Then it grew into a frenzy. Music blogs ran headlines like wildfire, the unknown voice breaking the internet. The most haunting song you'll hear this year. Who is the man behind Shelter? Podcasts speculated, TikToks dissected every syllable. Some claimed it was a famous singer in disguise. Others swore it had to be a ghostwriter stepping out of the shadows. But most didn't care who it was. They just wanted more. People looped the track for hours, letting the raw honesty of it settle into their bones. Comments poured in by the thousands. "I haven't cried to a song in years. This broke something open in me." He sounds like he's lived through hell, and somehow he still sings like he believes in something. "Please, whoever you are, don't stay hidden." James had no idea. He didn't check social media, he didn't have Wi-Fi, much less a phone with a data plan. He was still waking up on cots, still walking Lily to the community center for breakfast, still strumming his guitar on the sidewalk like nothing had changed. But Elena saw the storm brewing. She watched the numbers climb, watched the messages flood her inbox from producers, journalists, label execs who sensed a gold mine under the gravel. Everyone wanted to own it, to put a face to the pain. They didn't care about the story, only the sensation. And still, she said nothing, because she knew what fame had done to people like James. He was a man rebuilt from ashes, one note at a time. And the world, with all its cameras and claws, could just as easily tear him apart again. Still, it was only a matter of time. A popular radio host aired the clip live, voice cracking by the second verse. A Hollywood actor reposted the video to 20 million followers with a caption that simply read, "Whoever this is, you saved my life today." By the end of the week, the industry was on fire with one question: who is this man with the golden voice? And James. He was back on his corner, playing for spare change, completely unaware that the world had already fallen in love with a song he wasn't sure he was ready to claim. James felt it before he saw it. The glances, the way strangers lingered too long, the questions that came from people who never used to speak to him. He'd finish a song on the corner, and someone would walk up, not with $1 or a compliment, but with a phone in their hand, screen glowing, video recording already rolling. "Hey, are you the guy from that song, the Shelter one?" James would shrug. "Don't know what you're talking about," he'd say, his voice flat, but it didn't matter. The resemblance was undeniable. The voice was too exact. Someone had connected the dots. It spread faster than he could run. Local news reporters started showing up near the shelter. A woman with a clipboard tried to follow Lily to school. Photographers hung near the soup kitchen, like vultures waiting for something to die. And James? He panicked. All he could see was the past playing out again, the meetings, the interviews, the fake grins from men in suits who'd never written a song in their lives, the promises, the pressure, the applause that felt like a trapdoor. He had built his life back from ruins, piece by fragile piece, for Lily, for survival. He didn't want it picked apart again. So he disappeared. He stopped showing up at his usual spot, moved to a different side of the city, took a cot at a different shelter under a different name. He shaved the beard, cut his hair, switched out his guitar case for an old backpack. Elena called, left messages. No response. She showed up at the shelter one evening, but he was already gone. Lily's crayon drawings were still taped to the wall near the cot they'd been sleeping in, and that nearly broke her. James didn't leave because he was ashamed of the song. He left because the world was knocking at his door again, and he didn't know how to let it in without losing everything he'd fought to protect, especially the one thing that mattered more than his music. Lily. It took Elena 5 days to find him. 5 days of dead ends, missed leads, shelter coordinators who politely refused to say a word, and staff who didn't know or pretended not to know where James Monroe had vanished to. But she knew he hadn't gone far. Not with Lily. He was a man trying to stay invisible, not someone trying to disappear. And when she finally spotted him, it wasn't at a shelter or a community kitchen. It was under a rusted overpass on the west side of the city, where people walked fast and didn't make eye contact. He was sitting on the curb, guitar resting beside him, Lily curled against his side, wrapped in a patchwork of donated blankets. The hum of passing cars drowned out the world around them, but Elena didn't need to hear the music to know it was still playing in his head. She stood there for a minute before she approached. James saw her before she said anything. His shoulders stiffened, the way someone braces before a storm. I figured you'd find me, he said quietly, not looking at her. Elena stepped closer, crouching down to his level. Why'd you run? He rubbed his hands together for warmth. His eyes were tired, rimmed red. Because last time I got close to something good, it got taken from me. She glanced down at Lily, who was dozing with her head on his chest. This isn't about the song, is it? He shook his head. It never was. He looked up at her then, his voice barely more than a whisper. You don't get it. When people start clapping, they start wanting, and when they want something from me, they tear pieces off until there's nothing left. Elena's gaze didn't waver. I'm not here to take anything, he scoffed under his breath. You already did. You took the only thing I had left, my anonymity. She didn't flinch. I didn't do that. Your voice did. Your truth. James looked down at Lily. Her small hand clutched his coat like she was afraid of losing him in her sleep. I'm not scared of failing, he said. I'm scared of being someone again. Elena sat beside him, shoulder to shoulder, on the freezing concrete. Then be someone for her, she said. No lights, no cameras, just a man who didn't run this time. The wind had settled, but the air still held the bite of early spring, hopeful, but not yet kind. James sat with his back against the cold brick wall beneath the overpass, the sound of distant traffic pulsing like a heartbeat behind them. Elena hadn't left his side. She didn't press. She just sat there, her presence quiet but grounding, like she wasn't waiting for him to say something profound, like she knew the silence was heavy enough. James stared at the streetlight flickering above, its weak glow casting long shadows across the cracked sidewalk. He didn't look at her when he spoke. She thinks I can give her more, he said, that this song, this attention, it means we're close to something better, and I want to believe that. I do. Elena tilted her head slightly, her voice calm. Then what's stopping you? He sighed. Because I've been here before, not on the street, not like this, but close. And I remember the way it felt when it all slipped away, when I couldn't stop it. She didn't interrupt. I couldn't save Julia, he said quietly, couldn't save my career, couldn't save anything. And now Lily's looking at me like I'm still that man I used to be, like I'm going to rise from the ashes and build her some kind of fairy tale life. He shook his head, voice rough. But I'm just a guy who sings to survive. Elena turned toward him. You're wrong. He looked at her, startled by the certainty in her tone. Lily doesn't need you to be famous, James. She doesn't need you to be perfect. She just needs you to stay, to show up, to be present. She paused, to be brave enough to try. He looked down at the sleeping girl tucked against him, her breath soft and even, her fingers still tangled in his coat. You think showing up is enough? I think, Elena said, for a little girl who's already lost too much, showing up might be everything. James swallowed hard. She reached over, gently touched his shoulder. You're already someone. To her, you're everything. Don't run from that. Let it be the reason you don't disappear again. And this time, he didn't look away. The lights were warm, but the studio was cold in that artificial way that made James's palms sweat and his throat dry. He sat in a chair that felt too new, too clean, surrounded by walls that muted sound the way the industry had once muted him. Across from him sat the host, kind eyes, polished voice, practiced pauses, the kind of man who knew how to navigate trauma without getting his hands dirty. James had said no 3 times before Elena talked him into it, not for the fame, not for the exposure, just so people would hear the truth from him before they built their own version. Now, the cameras were rolling. The red light blinked to life. And the world was listening. The host leaned in, his tone gentle. James, your song, Shelter, has struck a chord with millions, but until now, no one really knew the man behind it. Can you tell us, where have you been? James exhaled slowly, trying to stay alive. He said it simply, but the weight of it landed hard in the room. The host nodded, encouraged him silently. I was a musician once, James continued. Had a shot, label deal, a small tour. People thought I was going somewhere, so did I. He paused. Then life changed. He glanced toward the camera for a second, then away. My wife died in a car accident. Our daughter Lily was in the back seat. She made it. Julia didn't. He swallowed. The words came out clipped, but his voice held steady. After that, music didn't make sense anymore. Nothing did. I stopped writing, stopped singing. I stopped showing up for myself, for her. He looked down at his hands, calloused and cracked. We lost everything, and I couldn't give Lily a roof or stability or even answers. The only thing I could give her was a song. The host didn't speak. Let the silence breathe. James looked up again. Shelter wasn't supposed to go viral. It wasn't a comeback. It was a lullaby for my daughter, for anyone holding on by their fingertips. He paused, the room thick with stillness. And if that's all I ever sing, he said, it'll be enough. And for the first time in years, he believed it. The studio lights dimmed, casting a soft hush over the crowd. The air buzzed with anticipation, the kind that filled a room just before something sacred happened. James stood behind the curtain, guitar slung across his shoulder, heart pounding so loud he could barely hear the stage manager's countdown. His fingers fumbled over the tuning pegs, not because the strings needed it, but because he needed something to do, something to ground him. This wasn't a smoky bar or a city corner. This was national television. Millions would be watching. He hadn't stood on a stage like this in years. And back then, everything had been different. He'd been someone else. A whisper passed over the audience as the host introduced him. You've heard his voice? You've felt his story? Please welcome James Monroe. Applause rose like a wave and crashed into silence. The curtain lifted. James stepped into the light. He squinted, momentarily stunned by the brightness, by the size of the space. But then he saw her, Lily, front row, hair in braids, new dress they'd picked out together at a second-hand shop, her tiny feet swinging just above the floor. She clutched the stuffed bunny she never let go of. And when their eyes met, she smiled, big and bright, like this wasn't terrifying at all, like it was just another night of her daddy singing the butterfly song in the shelter before bed. And just like that, the fear cracked open. He stepped to the mic, took a breath, and played. The first chord rang out clear and warm, the kind of sound that settled into people's bones. His voice followed, steady, raw, fuller than it had ever been, not because it was perfect, but because it was honest. He didn't sing for the cameras, he didn't sing for the charts or the fame. He sang for Lily. Each lyric carried the weight of everything they'd survived, the loss, the street corners, the sleepless nights, but also the laughter, the small victories, the hope that refused to die. And through it all, his eyes never left hers. Because in that moment, James wasn't making a comeback, he was simply coming home. The office space wasn't much, just 2 rooms above an old print shop downtown, with mismatched furniture, a borrowed coffee maker, and a window that stuck when you tried to open it. But James stood in the doorway like it was a cathedral. The walls were bare for now, except for a corkboard with pinned Polaroids of buskers, session artists, and street corner singers, faces weathered by survival, voices forgotten by an industry that only listened when it was profitable. He ran a hand over the desk, the edge still rough from where Lily had helped him sand it down the week before. She'd drawn a tiny heart in the corner with a pink marker, and he hadn't bothered to scrub it off. This place, the Sixth String Foundation, wasn't built to make hits. It was built to make space. A safe one, where music could live without being stripped, packaged, and sold. Where people who'd lost everything, just like he had, could walk in, sit down, and feel human again. Instruments were donated. Rehearsal rooms were shared. Stories were traded like currency. Elena had believed in it from the start. She'd shown up to that first meeting with the boardroom fire in her eyes, pitching the idea like it was the most important project she'd ever touched. And maybe for her, it was. She didn't just fund the nonprofit. She opened her studios, lent her name, called in favors that took years to earn, not because she needed the credit, because she saw what James saw. That music had saved him, but not everyone got that chance. Now he was giving it. Every week he sat in with a new artist, someone fresh out of rehab, someone who hadn't touched a piano since they lost their home, someone who had nothing but a song rattling around in their chest and nowhere to put it. James listened. He nodded. He played along. He still sang, sure, still wrote, still performed when it felt right. But that wasn't who he was anymore. He wasn't just a musician. He was a bridge, a place for others to start again. The house wasn't big. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a porch that creaked when you stepped on the 3rd plank, and a backyard just wide enough for a tired swing set and a few stubborn patches of grass trying to survive the season. But to James and Lily, it might as well have been a palace. The first night, they ate dinner on the living room floor, paper plates, mismatched chairs, Lily in her pajamas long before the sun went down. She laughed through every bite, feet tapping to a rhythm only she could hear, her eyes flicking excitedly from wall to wall like she couldn't believe they all belonged to them. James sat beside her, watching, still in disbelief, still trying to adjust to the quiet, no shelter check-ins, no curfews, no shared spaces where strangers wept behind paper-thin walls. Just a home, theirs. On the counter sat a letter, the official deed, signed and sealed. Elena had helped, of course she had, not with some grand gesture, not with cameras or contracts, just quiet guidance, subtle nudges, a look that said, "You've earned this. Let yourself believe it." He did. And weeks later, when the town hosted its summer music series in the square, James took the stage again, not as a ghost trying to be seen, not as a man begging the world to listen, but as himself. Lily sat in the front row, legs crossed, her chin in her hands, a grin stretched so wide across her face it made his chest ache. She wore the same little heart necklace Elena had given her the day they moved in, her hair braided neatly, her cheeks flushed from running through the grass before the show. And off to the side, behind the crowd, stood Elena, arms crossed, eyes soft, watching him with that rare kind of pride that doesn't come from ownership but from witness. He strummed the first chord, and as his voice rose into the warm night air, he knew he wasn't carrying the song alone. It carried him, not a man broken, not a man lost, a man reborn,